In this video, I'm going to show you the audio feedback capabilities of the EMG and breathing application. Now, just like the basic EMG application, there are three forms of audio feedback. They are tone, MIDI, and threshold. But as with the EMG and breathing application generally, the three forms are a step on in terms of complexity. Okay, here we are in the EMG with breathing application, and the first thing to say is that the controls for audio feedback are right at the bottom of the display, so right in this row here. So first MIDI and then tone feedback and then threshold based feedback. And just as before, we have a simple on-off switch or a play and stop switch, and then a slider, a volume slider, and that's for each one of the three. Now, I'm going to start off by talking about tone feedback, which in this application is more complicated because rather than simply being a simple tone that varies in its pitch to reflect the parameter, the tone in some sense reflects the breath, which is why I call it breath tone or breathing tone feedback. So I'll explain more about that in just a second. But the first thing I'd like to say about tone feedback is that you can choose which parameter to feed back through tone using this control here, which is a combo box. So you can select which of the parameters. At the moment it's selected to breathing rate, so that with this selection you can get feedback on your breathing rate. Now I'll come back to the point about how the tone reflects the breath. So the software generates a sound which rises and falls gently in pitch with each breath, like this. Okay, so I've turned it off again. So you get the basic idea that the sound is in some sense a reflection of your breath. It's mirroring the breath back. So it's helpful for doing breath awareness work. Now, within the sound, whilst there's a gentle rise and fall in pitch with each breath, the overall pitch reflects the selected parameter. Now in my case it's breathing rate, so what that means is that if I start to breathe very slowly, the pitch will go deeper, and if my breathing speeds up, the pitch will go higher. So that's more or less all there is to say about the breath tone. So I'll just give another demonstration now that the breath is maybe a little bit slower. Okay, so as I say, you could also choose these other parameters, including the minimum EMG, which remember is the minimum per breath cycle, and then the maximum EMG. Some of these later ones, threshold 1 and threshold 2, it's a little bit more complicated, and in fact I'm not going to try and explain that now because I haven't yet talked about the threshold, but you can read. What I'll do is I'll refer you to the user guide for this application where I explain it as succinctly as I can. Okay, so that's the breathing tone feedback. One more thing to add is that the range, the audio range, reflects the range setting in the long-term display. So that means that so this control sets the vertical display of the blue breathing rate trace. At the moment I've got set to 0 to 15 breaths per minute, and with that setting there, what that means is that the maximum pitch of the breath tone will be hit at 15 breaths per minute. Anything higher than that, you won't really get that as feedback, but because it'll stay at the same pitch. But anything between 0 and 15 breaths per minute will be heard as a difference in tone. Hope that makes sense. Let's move on to MIDI feedback. So again, it differs from the basic EMG application in that the MIDI note, or the musical note, is repeated not at regular intervals but once per breath. So it's one note per breath, and the pitch reflects something, one of the parameters of that breath cycle. So let's see that in action. Again, here's the play button. Okay, so you might have noticed there that the note came at the end of the breath. So it's once per breath at the end of the breath. And another feature of the MIDI feedback here is that, like the breath tone feedback, you can select which parameter to represent in the feedback, or which parameter to feedback, ranging from just simple EMG to the minimum EMG per breath cycle, to maximum EMG breathing rate, inhalation to exhalation ratio. These other two, threshold 1 and threshold 2, are a little bit more complicated. I'm not going to explain them here. I'm going to defer that. Well, I'm going to refer you to the user guide, so the written documentation, just to explain those. It's a little bit complicated, but they're there as features for anybody who wants to try them out. Let's look at threshold-based feedback. Now, it's definitely a step up in complexity in the EMG and breathing application compared to the basic EMG application. You may have noticed already that there are actually two threshold controls, one over here on the left and another one on the right. So two thresholds. The advantage of that is that I can have feedback on two different parameters. So I can have a threshold for muscle tension, say this one on the left, which is known as threshold 1, and the other one, threshold 2, I can use that for, say, breathing rate or some other property to do with breathing. Okay, so let's have a look at how that works. Now, before I say anything else, I'll just remind you of the point of threshold-based feedback, which is that the feedback comes in when something happens. So, for example, when you tighten up above a certain limit, then a bell sounds. So it's just the same in this application. And let's talk about the controls. So the first thing is that for each threshold, you can choose which parameter to base the feedback on. Now, at the moment in threshold 1, that parameter is set to minimum EMG, which, remember, is minimum EMG per breath cycle. So it's this control, it's a combo box. I'm going to leave it set to the same minimum EMG. The other one is set to breathing rate currently. I'll come back to threshold 2 in a moment. Another thing is that you can actually turn on and off either threshold independently. So just before I get to that, I'll just say again, the threshold, there's a play and a stop button here, just as before, and a volume slider. And yeah, but within that I can also turn off either one of the threshold. Now at the moment the threshold 2 is turned off, so that's done using this control here. So threshold 2 is turned off, so there'll be no feedback from that just yet. I'll turn it on in a minute. while over here threshold 1 is the same, the equivalent control is set to above, but I could turn that one off as well, or instead of. So I'll leave it where it is, and I'll just demonstrate how it works. So yeah, what I'll do is I'll press the play button for the threshold based feedback. Now it rang when I pressed the play button. It often does that. But the point is, from now on, that bell should only ring when this parameter, which is the minimum EMG, goes above the limit. Now it's a long way below just now, so I'm going to cheat by dragging the threshold right down. Okay, there's the bell. There's always a slight delay because the sound comes in after a breath, so it has to wait for the next breath to complete before you'll get the feedback. Okay, so if I move it back, there's no more bell sound. If I drag it down again, that's equivalent to the crossing the threshold. The bell comes in again. Okay, so that's the one threshold control. Now I'm going to show you the second one. What I'm going to do, I'm going to turn off threshold 1, and I'm going to come to the breathing rate threshold, which at the moment is threshold 2, because this is more complex as well. You may have noticed that there are several conditions here which I haven't talked about. I'm going to set that to outside, yeah, and once I do, I've now got 2 threshold bars, yeah. So let me just explain what's going on there. The point is that now I can have the feedback come in either when the breathing rate, as it is in this case, goes too high above the upper limit or too low below the lower limit. Yeah, so I can have it going either way. So if I want to keep it in a certain sort of sweet spot of breathing rate, then I can have the system warn me when I go either too fast or too slow. So let's again see that in action. So actually already the threshold feedback is still switched on. At the moment the parameter is between the 2 limits, which means that we haven't got any feedback yet. But if I just cheat again by, say, dragging that up.
Too low.
Okay, so in that case the feedback is a voice saying too low. So I'll drag that back. And now I'll do it the other way.
Too high.
Okay, so there's a different feedback, which is just again a voice recording saying too high when I go above the upper limit. Okay, that's more or less all there is to say about threshold. So we've got the controls here and the bar here, and again I'm just dragging the thresholds with the mouse. This threshold 1, the bar, and then the controls. Yes, definitely a step up in complexity, but hopefully you get the basic ideas, and you'll be able to experiment with that if you want, of course. So if you want, you're now in a position to make the EMG with breathing application part of your ongoing mindfulness practice.